Good morning, lit students, and welcome to the first episode of our new Sunday School Series LYAT. Let's yak about that. In today's lesson, what we're going to be talking about is one of my personal favorite questions: who made God? Now, this is a question that I've heard several students ask, both in our student ministry but also in other areas. And so, one of the things that I want to talk about first is, is this relevant? Because some of you guys, when you hear that question, you do think, like, is this even really a relevant question to be asking? Like, who made God? Nobody, because God is God. But I believe that there is a relevant element to this question, and there's a couple different reasons why I believe that. The first reason is because we are called to be disciple makers. In the last chapter of Matthew, that's what Jesus tells us to do. He tells us to go out and make disciples of every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. Now, if we're going to make somebody into a disciple, a couple things got to happen. First of all, the people have to believe in God. But then they also need to believe that God is worthy to follow after because Jesus is God. So, keep this in mind. The heart cannot worship what the mind does not believe. So, if this person is seriously, honestly asking this question, who made God? Then that implies that they might believe that there is a being in existence before God that potentially is greater than God. So that would affect how worthy God is for them to follow after, and ultimately whether they decide to follow after Jesus or not as well. But sometimes this question is also asked as kind of a test to see if we can give a good response to their question. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to think through this question so we can give a good response so that we can show them that God is a person who is worthy to believe in. It's not a logical thing, but it is something that you can do and you should actually do. And you can be confident in doing this. And this ties into 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, where we're given that instruction to be always ready to give an answer to anyone who asks for the faith that we have. And a little side note, it also can give us more confidence in ourselves as we see that we can give answers and good answers to tough questions. Having all that in the mind, what I want us to think about next is why ask the question. That's a huge thing when it comes to apologetics, is why is the person actually asking this question? And I encourage you, whenever you're in conversations with different people and that question comes up, ask, what is the context? Why are they asking this question? What are they really curious about? Is this just a test or is this an honest question? And that'll change how you respond to it. But first of all, what I want to do is I want to assume that this person is asking an honest question. So why they could be asking this as an honest question is because of human experience. We look around this world and we see all these different things in existence and stuff, but we have an understanding that the things we see in existence have a beginning. They began in some way, and if they had a beginning, then they had something that caused them to begin. And so if we're applying the logics of what we just see in this universe to God, then we'd say, well, hey, God's existing, and if he exists, then doesn't that mean that he also had a beginning? And if he had a beginning, then he had to have something that caused him to begin. So they're taking the logics that we see in this world and they're just extending it to God and applying it to him. Now, this is where the assumption underlies, though. It assumes that God functions like everything else. However, when we look at the biblical definition, we see that God is unique and he is different than anything else in existence. In Psalms 89, we read, and it says, "Who in all of heaven can compare with the Lord? What mightiest angel is anything like the Lord? The highest angelic powers stand in awe of God. He is far more awesome than all who surround his throne. You rule the oceans, you subdue the storm-tossed waves. You crush the great sea monster. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours, and the earth is yours. Everything in the world is yours. You created it all." And then in John chapter 1, verse 3, we also read a really nice, awesome, sweet little verse, and it says, Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. So Scripture is pretty clear about a couple different things. First of all, God is unique. He's unique. He's different than anything in this world. He's the one that created everything. He is powerful. He controls all things in this universe, in this world. It also not only applies to the physical things that we see, but the forces of nature that work within this physical created universe. So he's greater than the physical things in the world and the forces that, control the physical things in this world. And then it even applies to the things in the spiritual realm, angels, and we see the concept of demons, and you have the concept of Satan in Scripture. And all of these concepts, all of these things, none of them are like him. He's greater than all of these things, and he's different and unique than all of these things. And Scripture is also very clear that he is the one who created all of these things. He's the one who originally caused all things to come in existence, and nothing that is in existence happened without him being that original cause. So, whenever we go back to that question of who made God, the biblical answer is no one made God. No one made God because he was the beginning of all things. Now, for us who are Christians, this ties back to something we call the cosmological argument. It's a really awesome argument for the existence of God. We call it a proof for the existence of God. But basically, it follows that train of logic that this universe is in existence. And if this universe is in existence, it had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, it had a cause. That cause is God. Why is God the cause of all things and not something else? Well, for Christians, we would argue that it had to be something that was not tied to the physical or the created universe. It had to be something that exists outside of created things. And that's where we would say the Creator, God, he's not a physical being, and he's unique even among the spiritual beings in that he is the creator of all things. And so our response is he's the only one that logically would make sense to be the beginning of all things, because he's the only one that existed outside of all time, who exists outside of creation, and who is also fully autonomous. In and of himself, he doesn't rely on anything else for his own existence, but he exists completely in and of himself. He sustains his own power, his own being, and everything about himself. So that's our logical answer as to who created God. No one, because God is God. That's where that comes into play. But there is a philosophical element to this that I kind of want to touch on a little bit with you guys. And that is this identity paradox. Sometimes people have problems with this concept because they think that we're giving a cop-out answer. Who created God? Well, no one. God created God. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And that just doesn't seem to suffice for some people. But I want to show you that we're not trying to just do a cop-out answer, but what we're referring to is essential elements of who God is that makes him what he is. So some of those essential elements of God being God is the fact that he is the creator of all things. And if you start to take that element away from God and make something else to be an originator of him, then all of a sudden you're taking God and breaking him down into something that is less than what God actually is. So you're taking the biblical concept of God and you're putting him down on a level like a god like Zeus, or another man-made concept of God that had things that created them. So by the identity, the biblical identity of who God is, you can't say that something created him, because then he would no longer be God himself. And then another element that goes into it is that eternal nature of God. He had no beginning and he has no end, and that's essential for him to be what he actually is. And if we remove that, we change the essence of what he is. So, to give a physical analogy for this philosophical thought process, I have my paint palette here with me and a few paint colors. But first, stop, pause, and coffee. Okay, now we're ready. So, you see we have the color blue, we have the color black, and we have the color white. So imagine that the color blue, this is the definition, the biblical definition of God, the pure understanding of God as the creator of all things and the one who exists outside of time. So he exists eternally. Before there was a beginning, he was there. And after time ends and everything ends, God is still there. So this is the pure concept of God. Now, let's say that the white color, this represents a concept of God that is less than that. This is the concept of God having a creator. Something created him, and so that's what this color element represents. That also means that he had a beginning. He wasn't an eternal being. And then this color right over here, black, that's going to represent the concept that God is not the creator of all things. Okay? And you could have a plethora of other colors that represent different essential elements of who God is. But the thing is if I take a little bit of that color, a different concept of what God is, and I start applying it to this pure concept of God, the biblical concept of God, all of a sudden you'll see that this color is changing. It's no longer white, it's no longer or blue, it's no longer the pure concept of God, but now this is what we would call a baby blue. So this is something different than the biblical God actually. So this would represent the concept of God not being an eternal God. It's not the same thing as what he actually is. This is something different. And then if you take a different concept and you start adding it and you start mixing around and stuff, okay, now you're getting like a navy blue kind of a color, okay? Again, this isn't who God actually is. This is a man-made concept of who God is, but it's changing essential properties of God, and by changing an essential property of God, you're changing the identity of it. So, the identity of this color, blue, the pure blue, it's just we would say it's blue. But if you look at a color chart and you start adding a little bit of white into that, now it's something different. It's identified as baby blue. Or you start adding black, it's identified as navy blue. So with God, you can't start taking those essential elements of who he is and changing them without distorting the identity of what he is in and of himself. Another way to look at that is to think about numbers. I'm not a math person. You guys know I am not a math person. But there's a fantastic analogy in mathematics because there's this property identity of numbers. So 1 is 1 and it can only be 1. If you take the number 1 and you change it and you say that 1 is actually a different number, 1 is actually 2, well now then you have to change what the identity of 2 is. And if you change the identity of 2, you have to change the identity of a different number, and so forth and so on, into infinity. And so what that means is the whole system ends up breaking down if you change the property of the number, because when you change the property of the number, you're also changing the identity of that number. And the same way works with God. If you take one of those essential elements of what he is, one of those properties, and you try to reform it, well, now all of a sudden you're changing not only that property, but you're changing the identity of what he is as a whole, which breaks down the whole concept of who God is and what he is. And so when we are saying that no one created God because God is God, because he is self-existent, we're saying that not to be cop-outs, and not just being facetious, but we're saying that because it is essential to the identity of who he actually is. And if we would say anything else besides that, we're going to be talking about something other than God. If we say that anything did exist before him and created him, we're no longer actually talking about God, but we're talking about a variation that is less than what he actually is. So those are the thoughts that I have for you guys today. Thanks for joining in with today's LYAT. In the future of this series, what we're going to do is each week we're going to be focusing in on a few questions and thoughts that you guys have, and we'll sit down, we'll yak about it until you feel like we've come up with a sufficient answer that you are confident with. We're also going to be having guest speakers joining us. So in the comment section below, I want you to write down those thoughts and those questions, and write down people that you would like to come in and join in with our next YLAT, LYAT. So I'll yak with you guys next time.